Overshadowed by the disastrous defeat at Singapore, the story of the Battle of Hong Kong, fought between the 8th and the 25th of December 1941, is an often forgotten chapter in World War II. And yet, it's the story of British, Indian and Canadian troops, plus local volunteers, who fought a grim and bitter battle against an enemy that outnumbered them and with no hope of relief. It's the story of the gin drinkers' defensive line, a Dunkirk-style evacuation, a massacre at a field hospital on Christmas Day, a desperate escape to freedom led by a one-legged Chinese admiral, the first Canadian Victoria Cross of the war, and a loyal dog who would receive the animal version of the Victoria Cross. In fact, it's such a fascinating story that I've actually broken it into 2 episodes. And this is episode 1, and is especially for my viewers in Hong Kong, in particular Sarah, Charlie and Tim, and the wonderful James from the Canadian Pavilion at the National Shooting Centre at Bisley. I hope you enjoy it. The island of Hong Kong, measuring 31 square miles or 81 square kilometres, was ceded by China to Great Britain after the First Opium War in 1841. Following the Second Opium War, also called the Arrow War, in 1860, Kowloon on the mainland was also ceded to the British. And then in 1898, the Chinese agreed to lease a further 400 square miles, 1,000 square kilometres, for 99 years, an area known as the New Territories. The colony became a gateway for British trade into China and for Chinese exports flowing in the other direction. But when the new governor, Mark Young, arrived in September 1941, the peaceful, prosperous, exotic colony was starting to feel like it was living on borrowed time. It's sometimes hard to believe that just 20 years before the Second World War, the British and Japanese had been allies. The 1902 Anglo-Japanese alliance had ended Britain's period of splendid isolation, and for the first time, an Asian power was being treated as an equal by a European one. During the First World War, Japanese warships had helped in the hunt for the German raider, the Emden, and had escorted Allied troopships in the Indian Ocean and in the Mediterranean. Interestingly, based upon future history, there are actually 72 Japanese sailors buried at Kalkara Naval Cemetery in Malta who had been killed by German U-boats. That alliance, however, formally expired in 1923, following the Washington Naval Conference, and the two nations had drifted apart. In the 1930s, the Japanese had adopted an increasingly aggressive policy towards her neighbours, occupying the Chinese province of Manchuria in 1931 and then invading the rest of China in 1937. By October 1938, Japanese forces were in control of most of eastern China, butting up to the British colony. The expansionist policies of the Japanese alarmed the British in Hong Kong and in Southeast Asia, and also the United States. Japan was now seen as a clear and present danger to both countries' interests in the region. With the onset of war in Europe, Britain withdrew her forces from Shanghai and other bases in northern China. Hong Kong was her last remaining military presence in the region, and British strategic planners recognised that Hong Kong was, militarily, in an almost hopeless position. Dependent on food imports, and with a population swollen to over 1.5 million thanks to refugees fleeing the war in China, the colony was not capable of withstanding a prolonged siege. With massive Japanese forces on her doorstep, and the nearest British base 1,500 miles away at Singapore, the chances of actually beating off a determined attack by Japan were negligible, if not zero. By late 1940, British strategic thinking had settled on a harsh conclusion. Hong Kong was designated an outpost, meaning that it would receive no additional military support, and that those who were there would be ordered to hold out as long as possible, for reasons of prestige, and to tie down Japanese forces from going elsewhere. Winston Churchill summed up that view in January 1941. "If Japan goes to war with us, there is not the slightest chance of holding Hong Kong or relieving it. It is most unwise to increase the loss we shall suffer there. We must avoid frittering away our resources on untenable positions." The British plans for defensive and forlorn action centred on what was known as the Gin Drinkers Line, a series of fortifications running approximately 11 miles 18 kilometres across the new territories from Gin Drinkers Bay in the west to Port Shelter in the east, established in the 1930s. It was optimistically dubbed the Oriental Maginot Line by British military planners. But that optimism was more like a pipe dream. It was no Maginot Line. For a start, it wasn't one solid wall of defences, but a series of pillbox strongpoints connected by trenches centring on the Mun Redoubt. This 12-acre position on the northern slopes of Smuggler's Ridge consisted of a network of tunnels, observation posts and pillboxes designed to guard the most vulnerable land route into Kowloon. However, the redoubt did not live up to its name. The 5 pillboxes that were its strongpoints were over 2,000 yards apart, connected by a series of trenches and numerous areas of dead ground, allowing would-be attackers to get close without even being observed. The pillboxes had wide ventilation shafts which attackers could actually enter, whilst a design flaw with the pillbox embrasures meant that it was impossible to depress a Bren gun low enough to cover the steep slopes approaching the position. Furthermore, a 1937 staff study had estimated that 2 full divisions, 18 battalions, plus supporting arms, would be required to hold the Gin Drinkers Line indefinitely. Nowhere near that number of troops were ever made available. Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Brooke-Popham had been appointed Commander-in-Chief Far East in November 1940, a new joint command covering Singapore, Malaya, Burma and Hong Kong. At 62, he was the first RAF officer to command a joint force during wartime, though his critics would later suggest that he was past his best. After visiting the colony in early 1941, he argued that while he didn't advocate altering the outpost policy, he could not accept defending Hong Kong with the current garrison of just 4 battalions. 2 from the British Army, the 2nd Royal Scots and the 2nd Middlesex, and 2 from the British Indian Army, the 5th Battalion, 7th Rajputs and the 14th Punjabs. He proposed increasing the garrison from 4 to 6 battalions. Back in London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill rejected his proposal outright, calling any reinforcement unwise and arguing that, quote, "whether there are 2 or 6 battalions at Hong Kong will make no difference to Japan's calculations." And based upon what happened, he was right. Brooke-Popham's concerns were not shared by the General Officer commanding Hong Kong, Arthur Edward Grasset. A Canadian by birth who'd served in the British Army since 1909, Grasset, who'd been General Officer commanding since November 1938, was far more optimistic about Hong Kong's prospects than both his superior and the London planners. Equally, Grasset had a low opinion of Japanese military capability, a view shared by many British officers at this time, and he believed his garrison could hold out with just 1 extra battalion. But even that request was rejected by the British government. When in July 1941 he was replaced by Major General Christopher Maltby, Grasset flew back to Britain via his native Canada. Whilst in Ottawa, he met the Chief of the Canadian General Staff and the Defence Minister, and voiced the opinion that if the British were short of troops to defend the colony, then maybe Canadian troops should be sent. Arriving in London, Grasset presented an upbeat assessment, dependent on an additional 2 battalions of reinforcements being sent to the colony. The British liked his upbeat assessment, and his suggestion that Canadian troops could fill the void. On the 19th of September, the British government cabled Ottawa asking if Canada could provide troops, and this was duly approved by the Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King on the 29th of September. 2 battalions from the Canadian Army, the 1st Battalion, Winnipeg Grenadiers, and the 1st Battalion, Royal Rifles of Canada, were ordered to Hong Kong. The Winnipeg Grenadiers had only just arrived back in Canada, having been on garrison duty in Jamaica. Most men had no combat experience and were not fully trained. Likewise, the men of the 1st Battalion Royal Rifles were equally unprepared for what lay ahead, having never been out of Canada and lacking field experience and combat training. They arrived in Hong Kong on the 16th of November 1941. Just 3 weeks later, they would face the Japanese onslaught. Whilst all the lobbying and horse trading was taking place, Major General Maltby was unimpressed with his new command. He found that the much vaunted Gin Drinkers line was not only undermanned, but in certain places had been left for nature to reclaim it. Furthermore, the troops, in his eyes, had got lax enjoying life in the colony. Despite his misgivings, the 51-year-old, who'd been commissioned in the British Indian Army in 1908 and served in Mesopotamia in the First World War, immediately set about improving the garrison. Within a month of his arrival, he proposed raising a Hong Kong Chinese regiment and repeated the call for more battalions to hold the Gin Drinkers line. Whilst his proposal for the regiment of local Chinese was approved, his request for additional battalions was not. In light of the situation he found himself in, he decided that the plans to hold the Maginot Line of the East were fatally flawed, and decided that the best he could do was blow up bridges in front of the line, conduct a token defence, and then retreat onto Hong Kong Island itself. However, when the Canadian reinforcements were approved, Maltby completely revised his defence plan. Instead of merely delaying on the mainland with one battalion before withdrawing to the island, he could now attempt to hold the Gin Drinkers line with 3 battalions. It was a plan originally outlined in 1937, but which had never been practised because the troops had never been available. Now he had the troops, but they wouldn't get the practice. Time was running out for Hong Kong. Since the middle of the year, the Japanese had been planning for the conquest of Southeast Asia, to gain war materials for her ongoing conflict in China, and to remove the threat of sanctions from the Americans. This would ultimately lead to the invasions of the Malayan Peninsula, the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, and the Philippines, as well as the attack on Pearl Harbor. Hong Kong would simply be swept up in that process. The plan was straightforward. Attack across the border, breach the Gin Drinkers line, capture Kowloon, then assault Hong Kong Island. The Japanese expected the Gin Drinkers line to delay them significantly, and estimated that it might take 2 to 3 weeks to capture the colony. In the event, they were right. It took them exactly 2.5 weeks, 17 days, from the 8th of December to the surrender on the 25th of December 1941. The task of capturing Hong Kong fell to the 38th Division of the 23rd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Sano. His invasion force comprised of up to 50,000 men, of whom about 20,000 were front-line combat troops, including the 228th, the 229th and the 230th Infantry Regiments. They were backed up by the whole of the 23rd Army's artillery, 10 armoured cars, some tanks and a regiment of engineers. Opposing them were 14,000 defenders, although Maltby considered only about 11,000 to be fighting troops. So who made up his outnumbered army? As well as the 2 recently arrived Canadian battalions, there were 2 British battalions, the 2nd Royal Scots and the 1st Middlesex, and the 2 battalions from the Indian Army, the 5th Battalion, 7th Rajputs, and the 2nd Battalion, the 14th Punjab Regiment. Whilst the Japanese 38th Division had been fighting in China for over 2 years, the British force was basically inexperienced. The Royal Scots, under Lieutenant Colonel Simon White, might have prided themselves on being the 1st Regiment of Foot, but having been stationed at Hong Kong since January 1938, they had not yet fought in the war, and had lost many experienced men to other postings. The 1st Battalion Middlesex Regiment, a machine gun battalion manning the 72 pillboxes around Hong Kong Island, had been in the colony since August 1937, and was hampered by the same lack of battle experience and depletion of veterans. The 2 Indian battalions were no better. Like the 1st Middlesex, the Rajputs had been stationed in Hong Kong since 1937, but again had lost many officers and NCOs to transfers and received partially trained replacements. The 14th Punjab Regiment had arrived at the back end of the previous year and had also been denuded of experienced personnel. As I've already mentioned, neither battalion of the Canadian Sea Force had seen active service and had just 3 weeks to familiarise themselves with Hong Kong before they faced the Japanese onslaught. Despite Maltby's best efforts, the recently formed local Chinese regiment was struggling to recruit men of suitable height or fitness levels. A more robust local unit were the Hong Kong Volunteer Defence Corps. Commanded by Colonel Henry Rose, this force of local volunteers had been founded way back in the 1850s, when the Crimean War had also denuded the colony's regular army garrison. They were not professional soldiers, although many had served in the First World War and a few had even fought in the Boer War, but civilians who trained in their spare time. By late 1941, the Corps could muster 2,500 men, divided into multi-ethnic infantry, artillery and machine gun companies, along with an armoured car platoon. For the Battle of Hong Kong, they would be joined by a group of Free French World War I veterans who happened to be passing through Hong Kong following the Japanese capture of the international settlement at Shanghai. Despite only being part-timers, the Corps would fight with as much courage and tenacity as their British, Indian and Canadian regular comrades, as you're going to find out. Maltby also had about 65 guns manned by various Royal Artillery and local units. Now, if this feels like a one-sided battle coming up, it got even worse. Whilst the Japanese 45th Air Regiment would support the invasion with approximately 40 Kawasaki Ki-32 light bombers and later 18 heavy bombers, the Royal Air Force presence in Hong Kong consisted of just 3 obsolete Vickers Wildebeest biplanes and 2 Supermarine Walrus seaplanes. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy's once powerful China Squadron had been stripped to the bone. Just 3 destroyers, all veterans of the First World War, 4 river gunboats and 8 motor torpedo boats. The Japanese Navy allocated 2 modern destroyers, the Ikazuchi and the Inazuma, along with 4 torpedo boats to besiege the island. Whilst the political situation had been increasingly tense through November and the British were aware that an attack on Hong Kong was imminent, General Maltby was woefully unaware of just how large the force across the border actually was. In contrast, his opposite number, General Sano, knew exactly what he was up against. Japanese spies had been active in Hong Kong for years. They had detailed information on British dispositions obtained from agents operating across the border and from paid triad informants in Kowloon and Victoria. According to local legend, one of the best barbers in Hong Kong at the Peninsula Hotel, where senior British officers had their hair cut, was actually a Japanese naval intelligence officer. The only thing that General Sano was slightly ill-informed on was just how weak the gin drinkers line actually was. He expected the line to hold him for 2 weeks, but was confident that when he did eventually break through, he would finish the campaign in a few days. Whilst his timescale was spot on, his predictions were the wrong way round. It was the island that would prove the tougher nut to crack. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese attacked the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Thanks to the international dateline, that was 2 AM on the 8th of December in Hong Kong. 3 hours later, Radio Tokyo announced that war with the British Empire was imminent. Informed of this news by Governor Young, General Maltby ordered Royal Engineers to detonate charges placed on bridges on the likely invasion routes into the colony. At 6 AM on the 8th of December, the Japanese 38th Division crossed the Shantung River, which marked the border. The Battle of Hong Kong had begun. Advancing from west to east were the 230th, the 229th and the 228th Regiments respectively. At 8 AM, Japanese aircraft were seen heading south across the new territories towards the airport at Kai Tak in Kowloon. They found the RAF planes still on the ground, and within less than 2 hours, what RAF presence there was in Hong Kong ceased to exist. From now on, the Japanese had complete control of the skies. Meanwhile, the demolition of the bridges by the Royal Engineers had not slowed the Japanese infantry down one iota. Carrying bridging equipment, they simply bypassed the blown-up bridges, and just as they would in Malaya, they caught the defenders out by moving swiftly using village tracks rather than the few roads used by the British. Despite the 2nd Battalion, 14th Punjabis, engaging the advancing Japanese in the middle of the afternoon, Maltby realised that his forward units were in danger of being cut off, and he ordered all his forward troops to fall back on the gin drinkers' line that night. He confidently believed that with the Royal Scots, the Rajputs and the Punjabs manning the defensive line and the Canadians and Middlesex Regiment in reserve, he could hold the gin drinkers' line for at least 7 days. And that would allow time to complete demolitions, evacuate supplies and prepare the island defences. In the event, the line held for barely 2 days. By the early afternoon of day 2 of the invasion, the Japanese 228th Regiment had reached Needle Hill, directly opposite and above Mun Redoubt, the linchpin in the British defensive line. The redoubt, as previously mentioned, had several Achilles' heels, not least that it covered 12 acres. When built, it was intended that those 12 acres would be defended by 120 men, capable of holding the position for at least a week. On the 9th of December 1941, it was defended by just 43 men, of A Company, the 2nd Battalion Royal Scots, with a handful of men drawn from other units. It highlighted just how weak the British position really was. And it didn't take long for the Japanese to spot that weakness. At 9 p.m. that night, a junior officer and 10 elite soldiers from the 3rd Battalion, 228th Regiment, advanced in rubber-soled shoes through light rain in single file towards the redoubt, breaching the barbed wire defences. 2 hours later, at 11 p.m, the main Japanese assault began. Desperate hand-to-hand fighting raged in the trenches and tunnels. Japanese soldiers hurled grenades down ventilation shafts and surrounded the command post. By 3:30 a.m. on the 10th of December, the redoubt, apart from one pillbox, was in Japanese hands. That pillbox, number 402, held out for 11 hours, until accidentally hit by a British shell. The redoubt, expected to hold for 7 days minimum, had fallen in approximately 12 hours. The Japanese had lost just 2 men in the attack, and taken 27 British troops prisoner. The rapid success surprised Japanese commanders who had been expecting a drawn-out battle and weren't ready to exploit this sudden victory until the following day. If the Japanese were surprised, Maltby was incredulous. A staff officer later recalled, "I have never seen General Maltby more shocked or angry." He was fully aware just how dangerous the situation had suddenly become. The momentum was now with the Japanese attackers. At dawn on the 11th of December, the 228th Regiment attacked Golden Hill in a full-blooded banzai attack. Despite the gunboat HMS Chikala providing support with her guns, by 7 o'clock the Japanese had driven the Rajputs from the hill. D Company of the 2nd Battalion Royal Scots, supported by Captain Newton's D Company of the Rajputs, counter-attacked in a bayonet charge and regained the position. But by 10 a.m, the Japanese were back in control. At midday, Maltby, having decided that the new territories and Kowloon were untenable, ordered the evacuation of all forces to Hong Kong Island. But with the Japanese pouring through the gin drinkers' line, would his forces actually get there? The Royal Scots, one company of Winnipeg Grenadiers who'd been brought over to stabilise the line after Golden Hill, and the bulk of artillery withdrew down to Kowloon to embark at Jordan Pier. During that retreat, 22-year-old Private John Gray of the Winnipeg Grenadiers became separated and missed the last boat from the pier. He was never seen again. Whether he was killed in action or executed by the Japanese, we will never know, but he is believed to be the first Canadian soldier killed in combat during the Second World War. The Manitoba government named a lake in his honour in 1995. Meanwhile, the Rajputs were ordered to move back and hold a line across Devil's Peak Peninsula before being evacuated. Finally, the Punjabs were ordered to make their way via Sha Tin towards the Star Ferry terminal in Kowloon Harbour. And all the while, Royal Engineers carried out systematic demolition works, destroying military and naval facilities, along with tunnels and several roads on the mainland. One of those demolitions was of HMS Tamar, a troop ship built in 1863 that had served as the Royal Navy's base ship and shore establishment headquarters in Hong Kong since 1897. Not seaworthy, let alone battle-worthy in 1941, but still seen as some sort of value to the Japanese, she was towed out into deep water and scuttled during the night of the 11th of December. But the grand old lady refused to be put down. HMS Tamar's superstructure became airlocked and she remained afloat. Shore-based Royal Artillery had to be called in to administer the coup de grace, finally sending her to the bottom. 2 nights previously, 2 of the 3 destroyers still based at Hong Kong, HMS Thanet and HMS Scout, were ordered to sail for Singapore. They successfully evaded the Japanese naval blockade and reached safety. Through the 12th and 13th of December, a Far Eastern version of the Dunkirk evacuation took place as the last remaining destroyer, HMS Thracian, along with the motor torpedo boats, launches, various lighters, and at least 1 civilian manned pleasure boat, and the Star Ferry, transported the Allied personnel across the short stretch of water to Hong Kong Island. And all the while, Punjabi rearguards and the Rajputs on Devil's Peak Peninsula had to fight off repeated Japanese banzai attacks. Shortly after 1:30 AM on the 13th of December, the last 300 men of the Punjab Regiment were safely evacuated by the Star Ferry. And at 9:20 that morning, HMS Thracian embarked the last Rajputs from Devil's Peak, while shells and mortars fell all around them. They were transported to Aberdeen Harbour on the island's south side, where General Maltby personally congratulated the Rajputs in Hindustani. Part 1 of the Battle of Hong Kong was over. It had lasted just 5 days. What hope did Maltby and his garrison of British, Canadian, Indians and local volunteers have now? Join me next time as the Japanese land on Hong Kong Island itself and Allied soldiers put up a desperate fight, which resulted in Canada's first Victoria Cross of World War II, a dog who fought alongside his battalion, a Christmas Day massacre, and an incredible escape to freedom by 50 British servicemen, led by a one-legged Chinese admiral. Make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon when you do so you don't miss it. In the meantime, thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing part 2 of the Battle of Hong Kong with you very soon.